Picture this. Summer, 722 AD. A valley so narrow 2 horses can barely ride side by side. The Picos de Europa, Europe's savage peaks, where mist clings to limestone cliffs like a burial shroud. An army that has never lost is about to march into a geological coffin. Commander Alcama's column stretches for nearly a mile, but the mountains compress them into a snake. Then the rocks start falling. Not thrown, avalanched. Boulders the size of men, arrows from angles that shouldn't exist. Soldiers don't just die, they're pulverized against the valley floor, or tumble screaming off edges into 100-foot drops, their armor dragging them down like anchors. This isn't Game of Thrones. This was Covadonga, Asturias, in the early 720s. While most of Europe remembers the Muslim conquest of Spain as unstoppable, 3 years to take an entire kingdom, history forgets the mountains where that momentum shattered. This was the reality of what happens when an imperial army mistakes a rebellion for a cleanup operation. Pelayo and his ragged band weren't freedom fighters in the Hollywood sense. They were done. Done watching their lands redistributed. Done with governors like Munaza who treated Asturian daughters as tribute. Done with a new order that had swept from Damascus to the Pyrenees in just 11 years and showed no signs of stopping. They'd been driven into caves, literally, and when you corner men in their ancestral mountains, you don't get surrender. You get geological vengeance. This sets the stage for something historians still argue about, whether a single ambush in a forgotten valley could birth an 800-year war, because Covadonga wasn't just a battle. It was the moment the unstoppable stopped, when a punitive expedition became a tomb, when Alcama's confident advance turned into a panicked retreat through the same killing funnel, except now the defenders knew exactly where the bodies would pile up. This is the story of how terrain became a weapon, and how a trap can break more than an army. It can break inevitability. If you're watching from Spain, you know this story as myth. From Morocco or the Middle East, maybe you've never heard it framed this way. From anywhere else, you're about to see how 300 men in a cave changed the mathematics of empire. Hit subscribe, because this 20-minute deep dive is going to show you exactly how the Asturians turned physics, desperation, and a single valley into the graveyard of momentum. Let's go to Covadonga, and let's find out what happens when the conquered refuse to stay conquered. 11 years before Pelayo stood in that cave, the Iberian Peninsula belonged to the Visigoths, a Germanic kingdom that had ruled for 3 centuries. Churches, law codes, a warrior aristocracy that believed itself unshakable. Then came 711. The Battle of Guadalete lasted 8 days. When it ended, Visigothic Spain didn't just lose, it evaporated. King Roderick dead, his army scattered, and 2 commanders, Tariq ibn Ziyad and Musa ibn Nusayr, facing an open road to every city that mattered. Here's what makes 711 so staggering. The conquest took 3 years, not 3 decades, 3 years. Toledo fell, Seville fell, Córdoba, Mérida, Zaragoza, all fell. By 714, the Umayyad Caliphate controlled nearly every inch of the peninsula. How? The Visigoths were already bleeding. A civil war had split the nobility. Roderick wasn't even the undisputed king. Rivals had invited the invasion hoping to use Arab armies as pawns. They miscalculated. Badly. Stay with me, because this context matters. The speed of conquest created a psychological weight. Across Iberia, people watched the most powerful kingdom in the West collapse like wet parchment. Resistance felt pointless. The Umayyads had momentum, not just military but narrative. They were the future. Fighting them was fighting gravity. But gravity has limits, and those limits lived in the mountains, while Umayyad governors divided up the rich plains of Andalusia. One region barely registered. Asturias. Look at a map. The northern coast of Spain is a wall of green violence. The Cantabrian Mountains, the Picos de Europa, valleys so deep they don't see sunlight until noon. The Romans had struggled here, the Visigoths had mostly ignored it, and the Umayyads made a calculation that would haunt them. Asturias wasn't worth the effort. Not yet. The strategy made sense. Control the cities. Tax the fertile south. Let the mountain people stew in their poverty. Eventually, they'd submit. They always did. Think about that. This is where Pelayo enters. Not as a chosen hero, as a refugee. A Visigothic nobleman, possibly connected to the old royal bloodline, definitely connected to the losing side of recent history. When the conquest swept north, Pelayo didn't die gloriously in battle. He ran, he survived. He ended up in the margins, in the one place the new rulers hadn't bothered to fully absorb. Cangas de Onis, a village in a valley. The kind of place empires forget until it's too late. Pelayo gathered others like him. Dispossessed nobles, farmers who'd watched their lands reassigned, men whose families had served Visigothic kings for generations and now answered to governors from Damascus. They weren't an army. They were a grievance with weapons. And then Munuza made it personal. Munuza was the Umayyad governor of Gijon, the regional authority over Asturias. Tradition says he took Pelayo's sister. Some accounts say a noblewoman Pelayo was sworn to protect. Others say a woman from his extended clan. The details blur, but the meaning doesn't. This wasn't romance. This was submission made flesh. In the politics of conquest, taking a local woman, especially from a noble family, sent a message. Your bloodlines belong to us now. Your daughters are tribute. Your future runs through our beds. Pelayo refused the message. He fled Gijon before Munuza could arrest him. Disappeared into the mountains around Cangas de Onis. Started gathering men in the caves and high valleys where Umayyad patrols couldn't easily follow. Here's where it gets dangerous. Munuza had a choice. Ignore a handful of rebels hiding in rocks, or make an example. He chose the example. He sent word south. We have bandits. Send a force to crush them. The response was Commander Alcama, a professional soldier, a veteran of campaigns that had broken cities. He marched north with what sources describe as a substantial column. Cavalry, infantry, the machinery of imperial punishment. His mission was simple. Find Pelayo, destroy his band, and remind Asturias that resistance was theater. Watch what happens next. Alcama expected a week, maybe 2. Ride into the mountains, scatter some peasants, hang the ringleaders, ride home. The kind of operation that doesn't even merit a footnote in the chronicles of empire. He was marching into a geological coffin. He just didn't know it yet. Before we watch Alcama die, you need to see where he died. The Picos de Europa aren't mountains. They're geological violence frozen in limestone. Peaks that spike to 2,600 meters. Valleys that drop vertically for hundreds of feet. Rivers that have spent millennia carving corridors so narrow that sunlight touches the bottom for maybe 2 hours a day. Covadonga sits in one of these corridors, a valley that feeds into Mount Auseva, where water and time have hollowed out a cave system called Santa Cueva, the Holy Cave. The approach is a funnel, wide enough at the mouth to feel safe, narrow enough at the throat to become a killing floor. Pelayo didn't choose this place by accident. Stay with me, because the tactics matter. If you're defending Covadonga, you have 3 advantages that no amount of enemy soldiers can overcome. First, height. The cave sits above the valley floor. Anyone attacking climbs toward you. Second, compression. The valley walls force any approaching army into a column. No flanking, no encirclement, no cavalry charges. Third, gravity. Rocks fall down, arrows fall down, panicked men running backward fall down. Everything favors the defender. Now put yourself in Alcama's position. You've conquered cities. You've broken shield walls on open plains. You've never lost because you've never faced an enemy you couldn't outmaneuver or overwhelm. Your scouts report a few hundred rebels hiding in caves. Your army outnumbers them significantly. The math is obvious, except the math is a lie. In that valley, numbers become a liability. Every extra soldier is another body clogging the retreat path. Every horse is an animal that can't turn around. Every advantage you've built your career on, formation, discipline, mobility, means nothing against limestone and gravity. Alcama didn't see a trap. He saw an end point. He was half right. Summer 722. Alcama's column enters the valley. Picture the approach. A professional army in marching order, infantry in ranks, cavalry where the terrain permits, supplies in the rear. The column stretches back along the path, soldiers walking in the shadows of cliffs that rise on both sides like walls. The path narrows, then narrows again. Ahead, the valley bends. Beyond the bend, Mount Auseva, the cave, Pelayo's position. The men around Alcama would have seen the terrain closing in, but they'd seen difficult ground before. Difficult ground is what engineers and determination are for. Then the first boulder falls. Not thrown. Released. Pelayo's men had spent days, maybe weeks, preparing. Stones positioned at the lips of ledges, logs wedged against rockfall. The valley walls weren't just obstacles. They were ammunition storage. The first impacts hit the forward ranks. Men don't scream when a boulder catches them square. They just stop existing. But the men behind them scream, and the men behind them. Now the arrows start, from the cave mouth, from ledges no one saw, from angles that seem geometrically impossible because the shooters are above, behind, and lateral all at once. Alcama's soldiers raise shields, but shields face forward. The arrows come from everywhere that isn't forward. Here's where it gets worse. The column can't deploy. There's no room. Soldiers trained to form ranks and lock shields are instead pressed against each other and the valley walls. Officers shout orders that can't be executed. Cavalry horses, panicked by the noise and the blood, rear and kick and add to the chaos. Alcama tries to push forward, toward the cave, toward the source. It's the correct instinct. Neutralize the position, stop the bleeding. But the path to the cave is a killing ramp. The Asturians above have the angle memorized. Every step forward costs bodies, and the bodies don't disappear. They pile up, creating obstacles for the men behind. Think about that. The dead become terrain. The wounded become obstacles. The army's own mass becomes its enemy. Alcama dies somewhere in the valley. Tradition says he pushed forward and took an arrow, or a stone, or a blade when he got close enough to the Asturian line. The sources don't agree on the details. They don't need to. What matters is the result. When the commander falls, the chain of command shatters. Now the rout begins. Soldiers stop trying to advance. They turn. They run. But running in that valley means shoving through the men behind you, who are still trying to figure out what's happening. The column that marched in as a snake now convulses like a snake cut in half. The same funnel that compressed them going in now compresses them going out. Pelayo's men don't even need to pursue. They keep shooting, keep rolling stones. The valley does the rest. Men trip over bodies. Men are pushed off ledges by their own comrades. Men drown in the river trying to find another way out. Armor that protected them in battle now drags them under the water or pins them beneath rockfall. The killing corridor runs red for hours. Stay with me, because the worst part isn't the battle. The worst part is after. News reaches Munuza in Gijón. The punitive expedition is gone, not defeated. Gone. Alcama dead. His army destroyed or scattered. The bandits in the mountains not only survived, they won. Tradition says Munuza gathered a second force, rode out himself to finish what Alcama couldn't, and somewhere in those same mountains met the same fate. The sources are vague. What's clear is that Munuza doesn't appear in the record after this. Now, think like a strategist in Córdoba. You control the richest 90% of Iberia. The cities, the plains, the ports, the tax revenue. To the north, in terrain that breaks armies, a small group of rebels has just proven they can't be dislodged cheaply. What do? You do the math. The cost of fully pacifying Asturias, sending army after army into those valleys, bleeding men and money against limestone, exceeds the value of what you'd gain. Poor villages, thin soil, no cities worth the name. So you draw a line. You let the mountains be. You focus on what matters. This is how Asturias becomes free, not through a decisive victory, through a calculation. The Umayyads didn't lose Iberia at Covadonga. They decided one corner wasn't worth the price, and that decision created a kingdom. Pelayo establishes his capital at Cangas de Onís, a polity so small it barely qualifies as a state. But it's sovereign, it's Christian, and it's the only part of the peninsula the conquerors couldn't digest. The unstoppable stopped, the momentum broke, and once broken, it never fully returned. Here's what Covadonga didn't do. It didn't reverse the conquest. The Umayyads still controlled everything that mattered. Córdoba became one of the most magnificent cities in the world. Al-Andalus flourished. Architecture, poetry, science, trade. The caliphate wasn't wounded. It was inconvenienced. But inconvenience is how empires start to crack. Think about momentum. When an army wins and wins and wins, each victory becomes easier. Not just tactically, psychologically. Defenders lose heart before the battle starts. Local leaders negotiate surrender rather than fight. The narrative of inevitability does half the conquering. Covadonga interrupted that narrative, in one corner, for one group. Suddenly, there was a place where the conquerors hadn't conquered. A valley where their army went in and didn't come out. A cave where a few hundred men proved that unstoppable was a story, not a physics equation. Stay with me, because this is where small becomes significant. Pelayo's kingdom was tiny. A few valleys, a few thousand people. No treasury worth mentioning. No army that could threaten Córdoba. By any material measure, Asturias was irrelevant, but it existed. And existence, after 711, was its own kind of victory. Pelayo died around 737, 15 years of kingship in the mountains. His son-in-law, Alfonso I, expanded the kingdom. Carefully, slowly, into the power vacuum left by Berber revolts and Umayyad civil wars. Not conquest. Opportunism. Here's the pattern that emerges. Every time the Islamic South weakened, succession crises, internal rebellions, drought, the Christian North pushed a little further. Not dramatic campaigns, gradual absorption, a village here, a valley there. The frontier crept southward by inches across generations. By the 800s, Asturias had become the Kingdom of Leon. By the 900s, other Christian kingdoms had emerged: Navarre, Castile, Aragon. The peninsula wasn't one war. It was dozens of polities, shifting alliances, centuries of back and forth. But every one of those kingdoms traced their legitimacy to the same source: the mountains that never fell. Think about that. Covadonga didn't win the Reconquista. The Reconquista wouldn't end until 1492, almost 800 years later. Granada fell to Ferdinand and Isabella 7 centuries after Pelayo stood in that cave. 7 centuries. But without that cave, there's no continuous thread. No, we never surrendered to build a mythology, around. No starting point for the story Christian Spain told itself for the next millennium. The trap at Covadonga didn't just kill an army, it planted a seed. Let's be honest about what we know. The sources for Covadonga are late. The earliest detailed account comes from the Chronicle of Alfonso III, written nearly 200 years after the battle. That's like writing about the American Revolution today based on oral tradition and political need. The Asturian court needed Covadonga to be epic. They needed divine intervention. The chronicles claim the Virgin Mary herself deflected Muslim arrows. They needed impossible odds, 300 against tens of thousands. They needed Pelayo to be chosen, righteous, unstoppable in his own way. Watch what this does to the story. The battle probably happened. A clash in the valley, Umayyad forces defeated, Alqama killed. This much seems solid. But the scale, the miracles, the speeches, these are the fingerprints of propaganda, not journalism. Here's why it doesn't matter. Myths don't need to be accurate to be powerful. The Asturians who fought in 850 believed in Covadonga. The Castilians who pushed south in 1100 believed in it. The Spanish monarchs who finally took Granada in 1492 processed to Covadonga to give thanks. The story worked. The trap became a symbol, and symbols move history as surely as swords. There's a military lesson here that repeats across time. Terrain can equalize numbers. A valley in Asturias, a mountain pass in Afghanistan, a jungle in Vietnam. When geography compresses an army's advantages, mobility, formation, firepower, the mathematics of war change. Superior force becomes superior target. Alqama wasn't stupid. He was trained for a different battlefield. The Umayyads had conquered Persia, swept across North Africa, broken the Visigoths at Guadalete. Open terrain, decisive engagement, cavalry and discipline, and overwhelming coordination. Covadonga offered none of that. The same lesson echoes forward. Every guerrilla war, every insurgency that bleeds an empire dry. The pattern is Pelayo's pattern. Don't fight where they're strong. Make them come to where they're weak. Let the terrain do the killing. But there's a psychological lesson too. Unstoppable is a narrative. It survives until it doesn't. One failure, even a small one, even in a forgotten corner, cracks the story. And once cracked, the story never fully heals. The Umayyads didn't think of Covadonga as a turning point. Their chroniclers barely mention it. A minor skirmish in irrelevant mountains, background noise to an empire still expanding. But Pelayo's people remembered, and memory became identity, and identity became kingdoms. And kingdoms became a war that lasted 8 centuries. Covadonga now is quiet. A basilica stands near the cave mouth. 19th century pink stone, tourist buses in the parking lot. The Santa Cueva has become a shrine, candles, a statue of the Virgin. Pilgrims who climb the stairs don't think about rockfall or arrows or the sound of an army dying. But the valley still feels like a trap. The cliffs still rise on both sides. The path still narrows as you approach. The river still runs at the bottom cold and fast. Stand there in the morning mist when the tour groups haven't arrived and you can feel it. The geometry of ambush. The way the space closes in. Pelayo's tomb sits in the cave. Maybe his bones are actually there. Maybe not. It doesn't matter. What matters is that people have come to this valley for 100 to 300 years to remember a moment when the conquered refused to stay conquered. 300 men. One valley. An empire that decided the cost was too high. The Picos de Europa don't care about history. Limestone doesn't remember. But humans do. We tell stories about places where the impossible happened, where momentum shattered, where a trap broke more than an army. Covadonga is one of those places. The unstoppable stopped here, and once broken, momentum never fully returns.